responsible not for like working at the camps, but he did a lot of the administrative type things to organize transportation in the camps. And basically, he's credited with making the death machine very efficient. He escaped after World War II. He's been living in Argentina. The Mossad, the Israeli like secret police, like have gone to Argentina and like kidnapped him in the middle of the night and brought him back to Israel. In the status quo, they try to give him a trial. He ends up being convicted and assault.
They give him a death.
They do it.
Okay. Are you making you the state of Israel or like it really should?
The state of making the state of Israel.
You the state of Israel.
One more thing. When you say, first of all, when you're
Gary's sorry, it's at the early 1960s.
60s, okay. And when you say international trial, you mean tribunal?
Yeah, basically you offer him like, the international community to and say, here, do what you want. Is that cool?
Yeah.
All right. And we have 4 reasons for this. The first thing we want to talk about is the appearance of impartial justice. So what we would say, the worst thing that can happen for Israel at this point is they take Eichmann and they decide they're going to try him in their domestic court, where all the judges are going to be Jews, where everyone involved is going to be Jewish, and therefore being directly affected personally by what happened in the Holocaust. We think the worst thing that will happen is, with this appearance of lack of objectivity, you don't want the international community coming down upon Israel and saying, what you've done is wrong. You don't want to be condemned by the international community for these actions you're taking. Like, you've already done something by kidnapping them. You need to try to repair your image as much as you can by saying you're willing to relinquish the right to try. But the second thing I'll talk about, but I'll take it first.
It's kind of a philosophical question. So, if Israel does buy into this kind of philosophy, why did it kidnap them in the first place? If it buys into the idea that the international community should decide.
Here.
I think the reason they kidnapped him in the first place is because they said, look, if the international community hasn't taken this step, we need to do something. And the fact of the matter is, now they've brought it to the international community's attention, the international community can and ought to respond, and I think Israel should give them that opportunity. But the next thing I want to talk about is sort of the nature of the Holocaust in general. So what we would say is the Holocaust has an international effects to those who were affected by it. It isn't just affecting up to the Jews who were involved. We say at this point, you want the international community to be involved in the trial of that time. But furthermore, we say you want the international community's recognition of the condemnation of what Eichmann did, so that you get the sort of legitimacy of every country who was involved, all the peoples who were involved in the crimes he committed, to say that what Israel wants to see justice done for is in fact a legitimate claim. But furthermore, we say this isn't a crime against the specific state of Israel. While the majority of the people in Israel were, Jews who were affected perhaps disproportionately among other groups, Israel as a state itself didn't care this, and we think they ought to relinquish the jurisdiction to the international community. You see, but furthermore, would say this is important not just for the international community and the other kinds of people affected, but for world Jewry in general. Jewry. It's a weird word. Jewry. All the Jewish people everywhere. We think it's very important that they too get to have a sort of part in this trial. But then furthermore, this is important for those Jews who don't live in the state of Israel and don't sort of see the state of Israel as sovereign. For example, Hasidic Jews who don't recognize the state of Israel as being appropriate means of political expression for Jews around the world. We think in this way you get to unite all Jews not behind having to support the state of Israel and its actions, but behind supporting bringing these sorts of people to trial. I think that's especially important when you realize that when you realize that the state of Israel is facing sort of pressures of being a transplant state, which is sort of like the next thing I'd like to talk about, which is the international position of this transplant state. Because as we said, the state of Israel didn't exist at the time that these crimes were committed. We don't think they have jurisdiction as a result of that. But furthermore, we say the people who make up this state might have existed then, but we think they are part of a broader movement that needs to be involved. But the state itself is a transplant state. It was artificially created in the not too recent past. And we think it's very important, especially given the position of Israel surrounded by Arab nations. You don't want hostility from the international community towards Israel, except for not from its neighbors either. We think this sort of problem is going to make the situation worse for Israel. But furthermore, we say you want to mitigate the perception of bias and disregard for international norms. We're willing to say Israel's already done a crappy thing by kidnapping Eichmann. I think the problem is they want to be able to have sort of that pushed aside by saying, well, look, we did the right thing in the end. Sure.
Okay, firstly, if you're Israel, do you really believe this is so crappy? And secondly, if the international community is going to condemn this kidnapping, do you really think they're actually going to try it? What about procedural rights? What about those kind of things?
I think the international community has two choices. Either they say, look, this action's been done, we've apprehended this guy. He was recognized as being someone worth inviting. He was just in hiding, they've gotten him now. Once he shows up, the fact of the matter is an obligation. Look, if I was in American society and I kidnapped someone at their house who had been wanted by the police and like dragged him to a police station and said, here, you deal with him, the police would then have an obligation to deal with him, even though he shouldn't actually have kidnapped him in the first place. Furthermore, I'd say it's like, even if the international community doesn't actually choose to try, and they're like, no, we don't want any part of that, what does that do? It gives sanction to Israel's right to do this sort of thing in the future. It's like, good for Israel in general, we would say. Furthermore,
wait, I thought you just said that you're Israel, so wouldn't you want this kind of jurisdiction in the future? That's what you
That's exactly what I was saying. If the international community relinquishes this jurisdiction, good for Israel. However, we think also good for Israel if the international community accepts this sort of jurisdiction. Okay, so the final thing I'd like to talk about in the point of the international situation is to say, look, like at the point at which you have violated these sorts of laws, you want to take the international precedent sort of thing, like kidnapping people out of their houses is not the best thing for states to be doing. We would say it's important that you draw attention away from the actions of Israel and focus it somewhere else. And we think by focusing in the international arena, focusing on the justice to be taken out there, and taking it away from specifically Israel, is a good way to get Israel sort of out of the problem it's put itself in, out of the limelight in a way that's going to be beneficial for Israel in weathering the actions that they have taken. But the final thing I'd like to talk about is sort of like the precedent this sets. So what I would say is like, Eichmann wasn't the only ex-Nazi out there. Like, there's other ex-Nazis around, like in Europe, in other countries in Latin America, who like would have been tried if they'd been able to get them in Nuremberg, but are now happily living away their lives. Like, the state of Israel certainly doesn't believe that they have the right to continue to do that, and they don't want to continue to do that. So what's the advantage of our proposal? To the point at which Israel has forced the international community to set up a system by which they can deal with these sorts of people, you create an impetus that has been absent since the Nuremberg trial, for in fact bringing other Nazi war criminals to justice. We think this is especially important because we think part of the reason the international community has been so lackadaisical in dealing with these people in recent decades is because there is no set procedure. You've now dumped this person in your lap and said, create a set procedure or like or deal with the consequences of that. We think that's very important. Furthermore, is the alternative that's already been brought up on point of information. Let's say they refuse to try. What does that mean? That means the international community said, you're willing to say Israel's going to do this sort of thing, like, go for it. It essentially legitimizes the sort of Nazi that I would bet Israel would love to see happen. We think furthermore, when Israel takes this sort of legitimate role, they can create a legitimate role for themselves in these procedures, which are very important. For all these reasons, we're proud.
I thank the leader of the opposition and now call upon, thank the Prime Minister and now call upon the leader of the opposition to round left.
Cheers. Thank you, everybody. I hope this is a really fantastic round. Like, I'll do the best that I can, but they're really great guys, so I'm sure that even if I really suck, this is going to be a legit interesting debate. Adam Bonfeld, he's awesome. Everyone who came to watch, like, I'm flattered that people want to watch. So I've got a number of reasons why you as the State of Israel should really not do this. And the first thing I want to talk about is just the international community and the nature of the international community's relationship with Israel. I'm going to break down space for a second because I can't think of a contemporary example for the time period they're talking about. But I think I'm going to argue why what I'm arguing now was also true back then. So Israel recently proposed a UN resolution. And basically this is a non-binding UN resolution that just declared that killing Jewish children, like the Arab terrorism against Jewish children, was a bad thing. This resolution failed, Madam Speaker, members of this panel. The reason that it failed is the international community is extraordinarily biased against Israel. There's a huge amount of anti-Semitism out there. Similar resolutions were passed about Arab children that have been killed by Israel, but this one failed. Understand that very few states within the international community actually accept Israel and actually stick up for Israel. At that point, if you can't trust the international community, if they don't even deal with you as a legitimate actor, I don't think that you can trust them to prosecute this particular person. Even if they think this is a bad guy, even if they think that he's a terrible person, if they hate you that much and they don't like what you did, I don't know that it's clear that they're going to put him in jail. Understand they talk about Nuremberg, but Nuremberg, many of the people who were being tried were tried for the war itself. They weren't just tried for killing Jews, they were tried for acts of aggression, right? Those states that were harmed, the states such as France and Germany, suffered personally because of the actions of the people who were tried at Nuremberg. That's why they had an interest in punishing them. This guy was a person who ran the death camps, and he's actually the person who just ran the death camps, was his primary concern. What you're trying for is killing Jews. They may not necessarily have that reason to put him in jail. They don't have the personal grudge with him that they have with some of these other guys. No thank you. The second thing I want to talk about is just you as Israel and why you don't really recognize the judicial systems of other governments because of the prevalence of anti-Semitism in the world, and also just because you feel like you're being for Jews to flee to for the world. understand that Israel, under no circumstances, and I know this because I wrote a piece about it, will extradite its citizens to other countries. They never do it, even when they recognize the legal system. They won't even extradite to the United States, because what they say is that we are a safe haven for Jews. We may try people domestically for crimes committed abroad, like we don't want them to get away with things, but we are never going to turn a Jew away. We are never going to send them to some other country to die because of something that another country feels like is their fault, right? We are never actually going to do this. I don't think that you should do that. The third thing I want to talk about, question is whether he will even be tried at all. Firstly, it's not like they put pressure on like the country where he was staying in to like turn him over, or like the international community actually sought this guy out. So at the point at which they didn't seek him out, I don't know that it's clear that the people that you're handing him over to are actually going to put him in jail. Like I don't think they necessarily care about this. The second thing I would say is, what about procedural rights? One thing which is really important to people in the international community, people who don't have a vested stake in this, is, did this guy have adequate procedural rights? And it may very well be that this case is going to be thrown out, or evidence against this person is going to be thrown out purely because of the kidnapping itself, right? Kidnapping was an illegal action. I don't know that it's clear that they would recognize the legitimacy of trying him based on this illegal action, right? Like if the American justice system is willing to let like a criminal go free because of an illegal search, how much are they going to let him go free because he was fucking kidnapped by his Honestly, the international community might demand that you turn him back over to whatever country he was in and he goes through an extradition hearing. I don't think that's something that you want to risk. So the next thing I want to talk about is why the unique nature of this, whoa, there's a microphone there. The unique nature of his crimes against Jews makes you the perfect agent of action to actually sue him. Now maybe like you guys don't think that like Israel is like the guardian of Judaism, but understand that Israel feels that it is the Jewish state, it is the guardian of Judaism in the world. If you feel that you are the guardian of Judaism in the world, I think that you are the appropriate actor to take revenge for crimes against Judaism specifically, right? Like, they're going to talk about crimes against humanity, but I think that this particular crime, and obviously like, there are other crimes too, right? The one crime that he did commit was a crime against the Jewish people themselves. I think that the Jewish people, since they have a state, have every right to see that he will be prosecuted on their terms, right? I don't think it should be like the French or the Belgians or the South Koreans. He committed a crime against the Jews. They have a right to retribution if anybody does. The French don't have a right to punish him. You have a right to hear it here. So the fifth thing I'm going to say, and this is going to be, and like a lot of you are going to disagree with this, but I think this is really freaking true. You want to ensure that this guy is hanged, right? You want to ensure that the guy actually dies, right? There isn't a question here about whether he like committed the crime or not. Everyone knows that Eichmann committed the crime. Maybe there's a question of whether he's the right person. Clearly you're going to try to verify that because you have an interest in seeing the right person like actually prosecuted. But if he is Eichmann, you want that fucker to be killed, right? Understand that you, as the state of Israel, have a vested interest in ensuring that this person actually dies. You don't care so much about procedural rights. You don't care about like the international community's reaction. You are Israel. You are the guardian of the Jewish state, and you want this guy who tried to execute all Jews in the world to freaking die, so you should freaking kill him yourself. With that said, let's get the points that they bring up. The first thing they say is that this will go a long way to repair your image with the international community. This would be a legitimate argument if you felt that you did something wrong. You didn't feel that you did something wrong. You felt that your action to actually seize this guy and apprehend him was a legitimate action. So I think cuddling up to the people whose failure to actually like let this guy go free for so many years is not something that you actually want to do. Further, as I told you before, the international community is very hostile toward Israel already. It's not like by just handing him over, they're suddenly going to love you a whole lot. I would question the impact at this point. They don't tell you what's going to happen if you don't repair the image. They don't tell you like to what degree you're going to require benefits from it. They just say, repair the image. I say you don't give a shit. The next thing that you say is that you want recognition. And I'm not really sure what recognition you actually they're seeking. That, like, you want recognition of like the crimes that the guy did, and you want recognition of this trial. This is a legitimate trial. Maybe that's true. And like, if you could acquire recognition for this trial and the legitimacy of it, like while ensuring that the guy was actually killed, maybe you would do so. But I don't think that recognition of the trial is your primary concern. I think your primary concern is ensuring this guy is actually punished. If you could achieve both, then yes, you would achieve both. But I don't think that you actually want to take the risk that this person is at all not executed, that he is not punished for the crime. Clearly, your primary concern is ensuring that justice is done. Your secondary concern is with the recognition. Maybe you can seek that later. Maybe you can seek it after the fact, but you really do want to see that he's punished. The third thing they say is, you don't have jurisdiction. Mr. Speaker, firstly, international law, jurisdiction, very complicated, right? Like, it's not really clear that this international body is going to have jurisdiction. Who are they going to put on it? The United States is probably going to have some people on it. Why does the United States have jurisdiction over crimes committed in Europe? I don't know that the international community necessarily has jurisdiction either. Basically, you're saying, well, a whole lot of people believe that they ought to do this, so they should have jurisdiction. I don't think there is a clear jurisdictional line here. But also, I don't care if you have jurisdiction. You want to see that he's punished. You're Israel. You feel that your state, your status as the guardian of the Jewish state does give you
you jurisdiction over crimes against Jews, particularly ones of this magnitude. Maybe if some guy just beats up a Jew in like Long Island or something, like you don't get a jurisdiction over that. But when someone actually tries to perpetrate genocide against your people, clearly you have jurisdiction over that. Absolutely correct. The next thing they say is that you want to divert attention away from yourself. I'm not sure what this argument meant. Like, I guess it's divert attention away from the fact that you kidnapped him. If you think it's legitimate, surely you want people to know that what you did was a legitimate action. You should argue for that. I don't know what they're diverting attention away from. That implies you're ashamed of something. We don't think you're actually ashamed of it. As I said before, no impacts to this. It's not like you're going to be seriously suffering because people are going to punish you for kidnapping the guy who murdered millions and millions and millions of your people. That's ridiculous. Do you really think that the international community is so anti-Israel that they're going to punish you for kidnapping a guy that murdered millions and millions of your people? If so, don't let them try the guy. Thank you to the yes. And the last thing that they talk about is the bad precedent. And they say, like, look, this gives the international community incentives to go after the other Nazi war criminals. Really? I think that when you do their job for them, I don't think you necessarily give them incentives to go after the Nazi war criminals. If anything, you give incentive for them to sit idly by so that Israel can kidnap some more Nazi war criminals for them, so they don't have to put pressure on the governments that harbor Nazis. They don't have to actually seek them out on their own. I don't think that's an incentive that you want to send. And I think that the international community is so concerned with issues of jurisdiction and so concerned with making this an international trial, you'll give them the incentive to seek out those Nazis on their own so that they can try them first. At the very least, these people will actually be brought to justice. That's something that you want, like if you're giving them any standard at all. I don't think this is actually a bad precedent. I think it is a perfectly fine precedent. We have thanks.
Take a look at the opposition for his remarks. Now call upon a member of government, Mr. Gary Feldman, to give an 8-minute speech to the instructing the notice.
Thank you, members, for calling on me. Of course, members of this panel, Jesse for debating with me, friend side opposite for their out to our case, this most august house, worth more recording. Now, first thing I'm going to do is, you know what, I was going to give an overview, but forget it. I'm just going to dive right into the points, the independent points that we get from the leader of opposition, because I think a lot of them have just huge glaring flaws. Let's talk about a few of those. The first we hear is the international community doesn't like Israel. Okay, that's true. We in fact recognize that's true on our side of the house and talk about why that actually works, why this action would work to your advantage in that respect. But then he's like, hey, you know what? It's really bad when people don't like Israel. So what should you do? You should not do anything to make them like Israel, not do anything to show that you are cooperative, not do anything to show that you're not this renegade state that runs around kidnapping people and trying them on your own. What you should really do is just continue pissing them off because after all, nothing will ever change. Look, the actions you take at this point will impact the future. The fact that people don't like you in the future means that maybe you didn't take the right action. We'd say, try to get people to like you in the future, because that might help you out. Under this point, we hear a couple things. The first is, what if they let him go? Which is interesting, because later on down the line, they're like, how ridiculous is it that the international community would care that you kidnapped him out of Argentina because, you know, he's just an evil Nazi war criminal that everybody hates. Look, so there's a contradiction, but it's not out of a love of Jews or oh, anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism. Absolutely true. Arab bloc in the UN, very anti-Semitic. A lot of anti-Semitic people running around. But it's not a love of the Jews that causes people to prosecute Nazis. It's a hatred for people who killed millions upon millions of people from lots of groups. They killed communists. Russia might care, right? They killed a lot of Poles. They killed the physically and mentally handicapped. They killed, you know, homosexuals. They killed gypsies. They killed a lot of people. They also kind of did this minor thing called trying to take over the world. People don't like Nazis. Example of how much people don't like Nazis and how much they actually want to prosecute Nazis not right now. Justice Jackson resigned from the Supreme Court in order to be the chief prosecutor at Nuremberg, okay? People care. People don't like Nazis and want to prosecute them because it's a great, you know, if the Nazis are evil, if I'm prosecuting them, I must be good. Then they completely just dropped the ball on what Nuremberg was, because they're like, really what Nuremberg was about was acts of aggression. No, military leaders not tried at Nuremberg, people who ran, you know, the concentration camps tried at Nuremberg. Okay, so the next thing we get is Israel is the Jewish homeland and won't extradite Jews. Okay, it won't extradite Jews. I don't think Eichmann is a Jew. Also, and this kind of comes down to the later point when they're like, Israel is the guardian of the Jewish people. Okay, Israel is supposed to be a refuge for the Jews, right? It's supposed to allow some place that, you know, Holocaust can never happen again. They'll always have some place to go. It's not like they're, you know, the avenging angels of the Jewish people, right? Mossad doesn't run around with capes and masks and like retreat to the Jew cave, okay? There is a specific role that Israel has. That role is to be a refuge. The fact that they want to hunt Nazis is sort of beyond that mission, and although they give it a thumbs up. Sure.
Okay, Eichmann may not be a Jew, but maybe the fact that they refuse to extradite Jews and try them domestically might be evidence that the state of Israel cares more about its special status than issues of international sovereignty.
Lots of countries don't have extradition laws, but this says that it cares about its purpose as a homeland and refuge for Jews that has nothing to do with its avenging angel status. The next thing that they say is that the international community just doesn't care about Nazis. Okay. So there was an international warrant out for this guy's arrest. There was a big trial, might have been called Nuremberg. You guys might have heard of it. You might have heard what actually went on there. Like there are a lot of good reasons. Additionally, I already talked about how the fact that opposing Nazis is sort of this glory thing because people didn't like Nazis because they killed millions and millions of people. Then they're like, oh, well, what about the procedural justice rights? Which is interesting because later on down the line they're like, international law is really complicated, and nobody likes Nazis. Okay, so if international law is really complicated, and to the best of my knowledge, Matt B. Ohio didn't apply to the international community somehow, right? If they want to prosecute Nazis, which they do, which we've talked about, which I'll talk about a lot more since they don't seem to get that on that side of the house, they're not going to use this excuse. But then it's even worse. Oh my God, when they come down later on and say, oh, well, they don't care that you stole this guy, they literally say, it's ridiculous to believe the international community cares that you kidnapped him out of Argentina. Why on earth would they then take that? If they don't care about it, why would they take it as an excuse to let this guy go? Procedural rights, not so much. Jesse gives a great example of this in response to a DOI, and I think that they just don't understand it. If I, regardless of my legal status, take a wanted criminal and bring him to a police station, regardless of how they may feel about me, maybe they would make a condemnation of Israel's action in the UN, regardless of that fact, the criminal's still going to be tried, right? Not like, I'm sorry, you're a mass murderer, but this was illegal, go away. All right, the next thing they say is Israel's the guardian of Judaism. I already talked about this. There are no massive avengers involved. There is no Jew hate. The last thing they say is, well, what you really want to do is kill him. Now, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and say that what they're saying is, it's an emotional catharsis for Jews. A lot of responses. One is, if that's true, if all you want to do is kill him, then why bother trying him at all? Just take him in the back and beat him over the head. Okay, well, what about the international focus on this, right? The fact of the matter is, the international community cannot take a public offer of here is this really, really evil guy, say, you know what, we don't care about it. We're just going to, at the point you bring it into the international light, the international community can't ignore it. At the point the international community can't ignore it, and all that publicity is focused on them, they can't just sort of let him go. Additionally, we've given you a lot of reasons why it's in Israel's best interest. You as the Israeli government shouldn't just be taken over by this bloodlust. You should consider what's actually in your best interest. Going that case side. The first thing we talk about is the appearance of justice. And they say, look, you don't believe that the kidnapping was illegitimate. I think that's completely irrelevant to the round. And the real response that we get to this is, you just don't care about your image. Israel doesn't matter. It's an island unto itself. They thumb their nose at the world all the time. I think there are a lot of problems with this, because at the point where international perception creates concrete changes, creates concrete benefits, that's when you're getting your benefits. You do care about how the international community treats you. You do care about having people in the international community supporting resolutions like it's bad to kill Jewish children. You do want people who are willing to trade with you. You do want people who will tacitly support your enemies in the Arab bloc in order to get oil. All of these things are concrete benefits that you get for your people, those people that you're supposed to be looking out for after the atrocities they suffered, that directly tie into your image in the international community. The next thing we talk about is the Holocaust, and I don't think this goes well with trends. We say it's an international offense. It should be tried in the international arena. It's important to get international condemnation. The slogan of the Jewish people after the Holocaust and to today has been never again, right? Never again will we allow this. It's important that there be an international condemnation to say not only do Jews not like it when you kill Jews, but the world will not stand for it. I think that's pretty important. We talk about legal mandate. They go, it's complicated, who cares? Look, Nuremberg happened. Nuremberg set a precedent. It may be a loose precedent, but at the very least, it's a precedent for how to try for Nazi war criminals. The fact that he managed to escape is completely irrelevant to his crimes. Then they say, look, it was crime against Jews, which I think is really interesting. Because basically what they're saying is vigilante justice is good. And they're saying that all the other Jews we talked about under this point are completely irrelevant. We talked about how it's a crime against other groups, gypsies, communists, etc. They apparently don't get any justice despite the fact they were treated the same way as Jews. We talk about Hasids who don't recognize the right of Israel to exist. They get no representation under this. If it's a genocide against Jews, you have to recognize there are Jews all over the world, and not only that, but it's a genocide against other groups who have equal claims. Next thing that we talk about is international position. We talked about this a lot, so I'm just going to go through it quickly. We say you're a transplant state, your neighbors don't like you, You have already sort of pissed off the international community by enforcing this international warrant in a very shady manner. Why go out of your way to piss them off? No response. The last thing we talk about is precedent. And we say, look, basically by making this offer, you force the international community into a position. By focusing the light of international attention on this, you have to have them make a decision. And no matter what decision they make, it's in your best interest. They say they won't take it. Fine. If they don't take it, they are legitimizing Israel's right to try Nazi war criminals. They are allowing Israel to sort of continue with these tactics and to get other Nazis, something we think you care a whole lot about Israel, as Israel. We're very proud of the post.
I thank the member of government for his remarks, and I call upon the member of opposition, Mr. Bonnefield, to give final instructions to speak to the House and
Excellent speeches all around, incredibly exciting. So I want to start off with an overview because I feel like Jesse and Gary's case, or at least their argumentation this far, have been kind of different. And I think Jesse started off with this idea of impartiality, talking about normative obligations, not to like co-opt the Jewish cause and not to overtake your jurisdiction. Jesse kind of realized that that's bullshit, right? Because Israel doesn't give a shit about a normative obligation. It's a descriptive country and it has a particular cause that isn't really concerned with morality or jurisdiction. Okay. So that's what we need to really look at in this round. It's not about the normative obligations. It's about exactly what Jesse talked about. What your implications are in the international community, what the purpose of your state is, and how to best achieve that purpose. That's what we want to ask in this round. So I ask you, if you're not primarily concerned with normative implications, but like descriptively, like a cultural state focusing on this cultural goal of Judaism, right? What is the best thing to do? Well, Israel believes it's literally the cultural mechanism of Judaism. Like this was what Zionism was about. All of Jews were split up across the country. Zionism was about reuniting them so they can be powerful again, so they can protect the Jewish faith, so they can be strong and stand up against the international community. Understand that Zionism, as much as they claim that the international community can somehow be your friend again, is all about being alienated by the international community. About standing for their own individual right to sovereignty. So I would claim that if this is what Zionism is about, and this is what the Jewish state was about, why in the hell would you suddenly start kowtowing to a group of people who you think are alienated from you in the first place? And that's essentially where I want to start my speech. And I want to group Rob's two first points together. And he talks about the international community's relationship with Israel, and how Israel essentially doesn't recognize the sovereignty of other nations, or doesn't recognize the right of other nations to apply its rules, which are fundamentally biased upon them. And we get this kind of interesting argument from Gannett. I think it kind of makes a little bit of sense. That, well, if the international community hates Israel, then you should just suck up to the international community. But understand what logic this is predicated upon. It's predicated upon the idea that if someone hates you, sucking up to that person to an infinite degree is always the right thing to do, right? This is just kind of silly. Certainly it's true in like the case of me and Robbie Kraft, right? Like we were in a Noni race, we kind of like, had a little battle between each other, and ultimately we just recognized we were each kind of good guys, and we didn't really want to fight with each other to the next degree, and now he's my friend. But there's some people who are just so, and I would claim that the international community isn't like me and Robbie Kraft, right? I would say this is the relationship we're talking about, right? The international community is like overwhelmingly against the creation of the state of Israel. Like it's fundamentally against the notion of Jewish sovereignty in the first place. So I think if this is true, if they've been so alienated just by the premise of your nation to begin with, then I think why would you ever suck up to somebody who would never, ever, ever, ever give the respect? I see no reason why you're going to do this. If you're going to be alienating the international community either way, then there's absolutely no benefit that's garnered from just sucking up to them because we give you massive collateral benefits on our side of the house. I think it's a very strong reason. The other response we get to this is the idea that Eichmann wasn't a Jew, but like obviously this is the point, right? Like this was an analogy to demonstrate how Israel doesn't respect the sovereignty of other nations. The mere fact that this isn't exactly the point would make the fact that we don't win this round. It would just mean the fact that we'll win. Okay, finally we get this idea that about this idea of the protection of Jews. And I think Gary draws another interesting analytic distinction. He says, well, Israel is only concerned with the refuge. It's not concerned with the active protection of Jews. But it doesn't give you any analysis for why this is true. Certainly, if Israel is concerned with protecting Jews, right? Like, clearly it wants all the Jews to come to Israel and like, protect their rights and protect them from the massive anti-Semitism that it perceives in the international community. Obviously, logically, that would extend to prosecuting people who killed lots of Jews. Everyone understands this. Yeah, what's up?
Okay. There's a significant difference between saying we want to protect these people, we will, seek to do whatever we can to avoid their future harms, and going after people who committed acts and were wanted for the international community by those acts. As far as I know, Eichmann isn't constructing a new death penalty.
Right, like I just explained 5 seconds ago how there is no significant difference between this.
Here, here.
Thank you. So the third thing that Bedrock talks about then is this idea about will he even be tried? Will the international community pick up the slack? Realize that this doesn't even matter, right? Because whether or not the international community will pick up the slack, you as Israel don't believe the international community will pick up the slack. But I think Ron goes a step further and he says, look, if the international community really cared about procedural justice and procedural rights, then they probably just won't prosecute in the first place. Because there's massive procedural violations of kidnapping in the first place. And like Gary uses a factually incorrect example to argue against this, and he says, look, if a criminal was like wrongfully searched and seized, or if we violated a criminal's rights, like when we investigated him, he'd still be brought to trial. Like he might be brought to trial, but he'd be exonerated from that crime because he violated his rights. The mere fact that if the international community respects procedural rights, then chances are the guy will be exonerated and won't be thrown out of jail. And I think they can't give you a really compelling reason why, especially as Israel, you believe you get a fair trial in the international community. Finally, we get to this argument about Israeli social catharsis in the fourth and fifth point. How Israel has this right to avenge Judaism, and most important is having this guy hanged to send an incredibly powerful message to the international community. All Gary says to this is, why not just beat the crap out of them? I really think this is just specious on fake. The reason we're trying him as opposed to just executing him is because of the fact that Israel feels alienated. It's because of the fact that we want to bring all of his actions, all of his crimes to light. We want to demonstrate to the international community that if you fought with Israel, you'll never, ever, 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 ever escape it. You gotta know that Israel will always take responsibility for its citizens, will never pass the buck to anybody, and will always be responsible. And I think this alone is enough to win this round because this is what the Israeli country believes in, and it's what the Jewish state wants. Let's bring it inside. So Gary doesn't give you much on the case. I think the reason he doesn't give you much is because we couch all of it, Jesse couches all of our arguments in kind of normative terms, and all Jesse talks about is, all Gary talks about is like ways not to piss off the international community. Again, I pointed out that there's no way you're ever not going to alienate the international community. The international community is just philosophically opposed to the creation of your state in the first place, and no matter how much you suck up to it, it will never, ever, ever support you. They've given you no analysis, no reason to believe that just by trying this one guy, you'll suddenly get more clout in the international community. I don't think the international community hates you because you violate other people's rights. At least as Israel, you believe the international community hates you because they're just fundamentally anti-Semitic. I think for this reason alone, you have no reason to buy any of Gary's analysis. Again, they talk about jurisdiction and they talk about precedent. All they say under these points is that it's bad for Israel to overstep its jurisdiction and it sets up a bad precedent. Rob pointed out very eloquently, and it was never responded to, is that if you as Israel think it was okay to kidnap the person, and they give you no reason why, they don't think it's okay, right? If you as Israel believe that to be true, then there's no reason any of this jurisdiction should ever apply. Because as Israel, you believe you have the right to seek out criminals, and you believe the right to send this incentive to the rest of the world, that they will always seek out criminals, and no matter how far you run, Israel will never give up on the Jewish state. For that reason, we oppose.
I thank the member of the opposition for his remarks. Now recall the leader of the opposition for the first rebuttal speech of the round after 4 minutes.
Very, very much, Madam Speaker, everyone in the panel, everyone who came out to watch this. Like I always love paying these guys. That said, 3 things I want to talk about. I don't think this is going to take very long. I think at the end of the day, this is a very simple case. The first thing I'm going to ask is, will he be convicted? Because I think they understand that, like on their side of the house and on our side of the house, you do want this guy to be convicted. This isn't just a question of determining whether, like, procedurally he deserves to on the basis of some kind of, like, moral or utilitarian law structure. Basically, you know he's committed the crimes, and you want to ensure that he is punished. Now, you may want varying degrees of legitimacy for that, but at the end of the day, your primary goal is ensuring the person who perpetrated the deaths of millions and millions of Jews definitely is punished. So the question is, will he be convicted on their side of the house? Will he be convicted in the international system? We tell you why Israel understands that there's a whole lot of anti-Semitism in the world. That's why it doesn't even extradite to the United States. United States, not the most anti-Semitic place in the world, but even the anti-Semitism in the United States is enough for Israel to not trust the U.S. legal system to faithfully and actually have these trials about Jews and about Jewish issues. So at that point, I think they don't trust the international community. We tell you about procedural rights, about how it's not totally clear what evidence he's going to get in, whether he's going to be tried at all, whether he can be exonerated. Gary responds to this by saying that international law is extraordinarily complicated. Look, if the law is extraordinarily complicated, I don't think that makes it more obvious whether these things are going to be admitted. I think it makes it less obvious. Nuremberg wasn't a clean and simple issue, right? They had a whole lot of deliberations about procedural issues, evidence, all of that kind of stuff. It's not really clear. They just said, okay, let it all in. Sure, he's going to be convicted. It was actually very formal. That's why the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, as they said, was one of the people who was the prosecuting here. They were really concerned with these kinds of issues. If they are concerned with these kinds of issues, I think there's a huge chance that he may be exonerated, or if not exonerated, not punished to the full degree that you want
want him to be punished, right? Like, maybe they'll have a mitigating factor, maybe there will be some kind of collusion, maybe they'll just have a compromise, which is very common in the international system. Like, you guys don't want him hanged, and like, we want him hanged, so he gets like 10 years in jail or something. That's obviously an extreme example, but like, he may just like get life imprisonment instead of death, and that's not reasonable. So if he won't be convicted on the international system, or it is possible that he won't be convicted, we think that you have to go with our side of the house, because at the end of the day, you do really want to see this guy convicted. The second thing we'd say is, how much does international reaction matter? So we basically attack this in two different ways. So they talk a lot about international reaction. We say, firstly, you as Israel, do your other policies reflect concern for reaction above other goals? We talk about extradition. Clearly, other countries don't like the idea that Israel tries people domestically for crimes committed abroad. They think it's a serious jurisdictional issue. They don't care. Israel does it anyway. We talk about the fact that you kidnapped the guy anyway. If you're really concerned with these kind of jurisdictional issues and international reaction, you want to send your troops into another country to take this guy. That's practically an act of war. The second thing we would say here is, how much does any one action matter? Because even if you believe the international community will take time into this, will this really outweigh all the other reasons they don't like you? What does Gary say in response to this? He says, look, they suck up to Arab states because of oil. Okay, West really likes oil. International community really likes oil. Do you really think that handing over one criminal is going to outweigh their huge pressing oil concerns for the Arab states and is actually going to make them like the Jewish state? They have a huge economic reason not to support you, not to support your policies, and they argue that by handing one criminal over, you're going to change that? No. The last thing we're going to talk about here is the notion of agent of action. I think Barnacle was really good about this in MG. Look, you view yourself as a Jewish state. That means that you are always in the business of protecting Jewish interests. You want to ensure that Jews are safe throughout the world, and that the people who would perpetrate acts of genocide against Jews, be it in Israel or anywhere else, are actually brought to justice. You are the legitimate agent of action. That's who you believe that you will be. We believe you're responsible for the welfare of the Jewish people and also justice. And also, I think that you want to send the message that you will seek out and eliminate enemies of Judaism no matter where they go. They can't hide behind other states. They can't hide behind the international community. And they can't hide behind other agents of action and jurisdictional issues. That you, as Israel, will seek them out wherever they go so that no one ever does this again. Not again, just when they say it. All those reasons.
Thank you, leaders of opposition. Now we call the Prime Minister to give the final speech of the round on Tuesday's side.
Thank you much, Madam Speaker, members of the panel, everyone in this house, chief friends of the opposition. I just have three things I want to talk about each level. The first of which is, who is going to be concerned by this issue? So we get time and time again from the opposition team this idea that the international community doesn't give a damn about you and Eichmann, and they're not going to care about trying you, and they're not going to care about seeing this convicted. They're just going to let him walk away now that you've thrown him in his lap. Remember what I told you in PMC? This is someone who, had they been able to get him at Nuremberg, the international community would have tried then. The fact of the matter remains, the international community is not, in fact, indifferent to these sorts of issues. The reason for this is quite obvious, because it's not just a matter of how warm and fuzzy they feel towards the Jews, something I'm going to talk about later, but instead it's a matter of how the international community feels towards those who perpetrated the Second World War and the Holocaust. That applies not only to those who lived in the Israeli state who didn't exist then, but in fact to those states that did exist at the time and were at war with Germany, and to people in those states and all over the world who were affected by this. We say, while the Jews might have been the primary people affected, certainly that's enough to bring this to international attention, to make it a concern. Furthermore, it says, in the international spotlight is the point at which Israel has taken this illegal action. They talk a lot on their side of the house about the fact of the matter that, like, Israel doesn't care about sovereignty, Israel doesn't care about all these sorts of things. We will admit that we don't think that Israel has the same normative principles that the international community would have. I never claimed that. I think this is something they fundamentally misunderstand on their side of the house. Instead, what we say is there are very practical reasons why this sort of policy is something that's going to get action in America. That's especially to talk about in the future of war crimes or Nazis being brought to justice, something they never respond to at all. But so we say at that point, this is already visible. We need international reaction to an international crime. And we think the international community will care one way or the other. Which leads to the second thing I'd like to talk about, which is the idea of the reaction to the international community. Here's why I was really, really surprised by the attack October. They conceded that we said, when they say that Israel is in a very precarious position because there's lots of anti-Semitism, that the Israelites have to be concerned about the international reaction. That's something they didn't have to concede, and I think they did. So the point at which they recognize that there's hostility to Israel, that Israel has to be defensive in these sorts of matters. They recognize that there's the potential for backlash against Israel every time it takes this sort of action. They've already violated sovereignty. They've already committed this sort of crime. But the fact of the matter is, Israel sort of exists at the whim of the international community, which tolerates. At that point, they do fact, recognize the laws of that community and make sure they take them into account. Furthermore, I would say is we think that Israel does also care about having this be an international issue. It's not just about the kill for them, as we pointed out. Bonnefeld's response to this, well, they want to have light on these actions. We say, yes, they do, and they want the biggest stage possible. The best way to do that is to have it be on the international stage. This is something we say in the very beginning of I say in my PMC. You want this to be an international issue because then you get this you get the illegal actions taken by Israel to be vindicated in the international community at the point at which they say, we are going to try this person and we will condemn him for the crimes he committed, and the entire world can see it. The only response we sort of get to this is the idea of they'll throw down a procedural ground. I think I responded to this in PMC when we say, like, once someone who is wanted for crimes is dumped in the lap of a group that can try him for those crimes, another actor isn't going to affect that. This becomes even more relevant at the point at which, like, there isn't a legal framework, as they themselves point out, that is going to, in fact, dictate what's going to happen. The final thing I'd say is this idea of the international reaction is because what we would say is you want to also be able to, if, as they say, that there is much hostility towards the Israeli government in the world, you want to separate trying Nazi war criminals from hatred of the Israeli government. And I think this is really important. To the point at which you turn him over to the international community, no longer is this just seen as an Israeli crime and something the Israeli government is doing. You get to separate that anti-Semitism from the action of the child in the first place. Which leads to the final thing I'd like to talk about, which is something that they never touch on, and I think is the most pragmatic benefit that Israel is and ought to be concerned about. And that's the idea of the future agency of Israel and these sort of actions and future justice for crimes committed against Jews and non-Jews by the Nazis. Because what do we tell you that I don't think I ever formulated that? When the international community has been ignoring this issue, there's no sort of framework that's set up in the status quo to deal with these sorts of issues should they arise. So we think what that does is create a lack of political will to find any of the war criminals that are still in Latin America, that are still in Europe. At the point at which you've taken this action to force it onto the international consciousness, and the international community has to respond, you set a precedent for the future. Either in one of two ways. Either you create a legal framework by which the international community does and will try him, and we think convict him because of the fact that they know he did. I mean, like, good Lord, we gave the death penalty to people in the Nuremberg trial, and we're certainly going to do this sort of thing again. But finally, we say they don't do this sort of thing, and they say, no, it's okay for you, Israel, to try it. Then that means you get to have the carte blanche in the future to say, we can do this, and the international community believes we have the right to do it. We offer them an alternative, and they say, sorry, Israel, you are doing exactly right. That's what Israel is concerned about. That's a pragmatic reason why this one particular case is big. You can sacrifice the international community for the future of all the war criminals you could bring